So let's start with how to connect with your emotions, okay? The objective here again is about bringing awareness and understanding not just a little bit about what you're feeling, but also how it's affecting the rest of your body, your livelihood, your psyche, etc. There's a couple of fallacies about emotions, and I'm sure most of us share them in some way. Again, these may be coming from belief systems from our families, from our cultures, from many other things, but they do importantly impact our ability to be able to both recognize and work with our emotions, as well as to be able to manage them effectively. And so one is that emotions are bad. Now, all of us want to be able to feel joy and bliss and excitement and inspiration all the time. And we spoke about that in our previous call, this idea of, being able to accept that that's not life all the time. What happens, however, is that we don't really love the feeling of anger, of boredom, of frustration, of sadness, apathy. And yet, these emotions are just simply the second half of the human condition. And so they're not bad. We call emotions in that respect signals. But they by themselves are not really good or bad, right? And we'll talk more about what that means. The second myth is that emotions are truth. Now, we just said that they're signals, but it doesn't mean that they serve as an objective truth for the entire world. So what does that say? They're telling you something about what you're going through. They're telling you something about what you're thinking, feeling, sensing, but they don't necessarily denote a truth for the entire world, for everyone else around you. So that means that if at one moment you're extremely angry about a situation or a person, that anger is valid. It's telling you something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the other is bad, because that anger may also be based on certain assumptions that you're making, some of your own characteristics, and maybe some stories you're dragging from your past that are making it worse for you, but you're also not necessarily entirely aware of the circumstances that are causing the other person to behave that way and cause that anger for you. So they're not truth. Pema Chodron, who I highly recommend to you, she's a Western monk, wonderful woman who has these beautiful little books that I call them little blessings, because they're very easy to read. They're like rolling meditations. I have a couple of them on my nightside table. And the idea is not even to get through the entire book in one reading. It's just to sort of read excerpts. She says something I think is especially powerful. She says, don't believe everything you think. And I would extend it so far as to say is, don't believe everything you feel. Again, it doesn't mean that it's not valid. It means that it doesn't necessarily represent an objective truth about everything around you. And so the third myth is actually going to seem kind of an opposite to this, but it's as well very true. And that's that emotions are unreliable. So they may not necessarily represent an objective truth, but it doesn't mean they're unreliable. Your emotions, again, are signals about what is happening inside you. Some of those signals may be about more serious situations, and we're going to break that down further. Others may be simply symptoms of a current situation, and you'll see that difference. The third myth is that emotions have to be either controlled, ignored, or always explained. And the reason that's not the case is, first of all, if we're constantly ignoring emotions, particularly emotions that keep coming back for us, what we're doing is actually ignoring an alert system in our bodies and ourselves that at some point might stop coming, but at a great cost to us. You'll notice that a lot of things like pains can be related to emotions, and we're going to talk a little bit about how to consider that, right? The second is they need to be controlled, right? We're not thinking about control like in a vice. When you try to control your emotions in a very black and white manner, what you're actually doing is repressing, in many cases, what we're doing in those cases. And that often makes us have even more blind spots about what's happening with us. And the idea, the last part of this myth, that emotions have to always be explained. Yes, there are times, especially with recurring emotions, that there may be a deeper reason behind what's happening for us. But there are also moments, and you've seen this, where, you haven't slept well, or there's maybe some hormonal balance. Maybe you haven't even eaten. Maybe you're going through a stressful moment. Maybe you're feeling lonely. And there may be other reasons that may exacerbate difficult emotions, but they don't necessarily mean that there's some terrible truth hidden behind it. So we don't necessarily have the ability to always fully explain 100% what we're feeling, but we can get very close to understanding it, and that's what we're heading for. Things to be aware of in terms of how to become more aware of your emotions. You need time. You need some space and silence to do it. And this is where a lot of folks struggle, because our current daily life is so focused on becoming so busy, on having to be optimally productive, on having to be so many different things to so many people, that it doesn't give us the opportunity to just sit still for a while. It may even come to the moment where a lot of folks feel uncomfortable sitting still because they haven't had that time for a while. And then all these difficult emotions will rush back and they feel overwhelmed. But the idea behind it is that no matter what is going on with you personally and professionally, having it a little bit of moment to set aside for yourself whenever, to just check in, not necessarily even reflect deeply, but just check in and see how you feel is key. The other thing is that this has a lot to do with your self-knowledge and your self-awareness. There are folks who have a very rich internal life. They understand themselves very well because they've been working on themselves for a long time. Other folks, not so much, and there's no judgment in either case. But situations like we've been saying, like being stuck inside, confined, either alone and with others, has a way of putting up a mirror to ourselves. And so I would say that instead of just fighting it, this is an especially important, also privileged moment to be able to kind of turn in and say, hey, what's going on with me, right? Is this a moment where I can maybe bring a little bit more ease, a little bit more knowledge to myself? And the last is, that's really important about becoming aware of your emotions, is some self-compassion. Self-compassion isn't about just letting yourself off the hook. It isn't about giving in. It's just about peacefully, without judgment, being able to recognize, hey, this is what's happening for me. And we'll talk more about that. And it's just the way it is. And it's okay. Now, where do I go from here? Because we spend a lot of time beating ourselves up for what we're feeling. And that actually ends up using up very important emotional credits and energy that we could be funneling in a more effective way to get feeling better. So how do you become more aware of your emotions? As we kind of hinted earlier, one part is this mind-body connection. You've heard people talk about this a lot over the last years, I'm sure. And how does this appear? Well, as we said before, it can come through pain. If these days you're feeling aches and pains, itching, allergic reactions, different effects in your sleep, in your nutrition, different cravings, all of these may be signs that, you know, you're just dealing with a new transition, some change, and maybe some frustration. That's not bad. It just is, right? So there's a really great doctor and scientist, very famous, Dr. Sarner. If you've heard of him, I highly recommend his work too. He did amazing medical research proving that a lot of back pain is actually connected to repressed emotions, often around repressed emotions like anger and sadness. And so, whereas the idea of the body-mind connection was something that was still thought to be rather mystical some years ago, it's pretty much been proven at this point. And again, the idea is not to judge it, but take note of it, right? And then figure out a way to work with it. Another is just simply asking yourself out loud, how am I feeling? I do this when I'm in the bathroom, because you got to sit on the toilet anyway, right? You got to sit. So what else are you going to do? You can just say, how am I feeling? And you may be able to answer at the moment, maybe not, but it's just a half second for you to check in. The other part that I really like about this is the idea of talking out loud. That's also for some reason a stigma, you know, this idea of you can't speak out loud because it might seem like you're crazy, but it's actually been shown through research that talking out loud to yourself is immensely helpful in being able to organize your brain. And if you're feeling awkward, put your plants in front of you, put your kids in front of you, put your dogs in front of you, your pets. But either way, I would highly recommend it. And even just a couple of minutes of speaking to yourself as if you were speaking to a coach. you know, or even tapping into what we say kind of your higher self can go a long way. The other part is look at some emotional patterns. You know, every time I sleep, I don't get enough sleep, I tend to have these kinds of emotions. If I'm eating these kinds of foods, every time we bring up the topic of money in the couple, we get nervous and it causes X issues. So try and see sort of the patterns that are bringing up some tense or difficult engagements for you, even just for yourself. Being able to track that allows you to kind of pinpoint what are trigger points or sensitive topics, and then you can either work around them or work with them. And the last is in terms of how to be able to really tap into what you're feeling is to verbalize. And verbalizing emotions, other than just saying them out loud, may not even be as clear as saying, I'm feeling sadness. If you have that kind of clarity, that's wonderful. But it could also be, you know, simply having visions. I don't mean like mystical visions, but, you know, someone once said, for example, I feel like I'm dragging this cloud around with me. Or, you know, there's a heaviness in my chest that I can't seem to unblock. Another person said, you know, I feel like I'm in a cocoon and I'm kind of in development and I can see outside, but I can't quite get out yet. You know, use the full breadth of your imagination to come up with even sometimes words, even seemingly unrelated words, to try and denote kind of what's happening with what you're feeling. This is a creative exercise as much for you, but sometimes, especially if you're a person that may struggle with verbal communication, but even not, being able to just find images or a color or smell or whatever to associate can give you some more clarity about what you're feeling. And so that's the first third of this, which is the idea of how to become more in touch, more aware of what you're feeling.